In 1921, a black Wall Street millionaire named O.W. Gurley stood on the corner of Greenwood Avenue and watched his empire burn to the ground. The flames weren't started by accident. They were lit by a white mob armed with dynamite, deputized by the local government, and flying in airplanes overhead, dropping firebombs on his neighborhood. His name? You've never heard it. And that's exactly what they wanted. Because if you knew there were black millionaires when your great-grandparents couldn't even vote, it would shatter everything you were taught about history. Let me show you 7 names they buried. Between the 1890s and 1930s, something extraordinary happened in America that your history textbooks conveniently forgot to mention. Despite living under Jim Crow laws, despite facing legalized terrorism and systemic oppression at every turn, black Americans built wealth that rivaled white elites. In places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Durham, North Carolina, and throughout Mississippi, black entrepreneurs were creating banks, newspapers, oil companies, luxury hotels, and thriving business districts. They weren't just surviving, they were dominating. And that was the problem. Because here's what they don't want you to understand. Every single black millionaire was living, breathing proof that white supremacy's foundational lie was false. The entire system depended on convincing everyone that black people were naturally inferior, incapable of building wealth or contributing to civilization. But when Black Wall Street had more millionaires per capita than most white neighborhoods, when black women were out-earning white businessmen, when former slaves were becoming landowners and philanthropists within a single generation, that lie fell apart. So the system did what it always does when threatened. It responded with violence, with legislation, and most insidiously, with erasure. They burned the towns. They drove out the families. They stole the land. And then they wrote the history books as if none of it ever happened. Let's start with the woman who became so successful that white historians literally couldn't handle it. Madam C.J. Walker was born Sarah Breedlove in 1867 to parents who had been enslaved on a Louisiana plantation. She was orphaned by 7, married by 14, and widowed by 20 with a young daughter to feed. She worked as a washerwoman, making barely $1 a day, and she was losing her hair from the stress and the harsh chemicals in the hair products available to black women at the time. So she did what entrepreneurs do. She saw a problem and created a solution. Walker developed her own line of hair care products, specifically for black women, and built a door-to-door sales network that would make modern MLM companies look like lemonade stands. By 1910, she was employing thousands of black women across the country, giving them financial independence and purpose in an era when their options were domestic work or nothing. By 1919, she was worth over $1 million, making her America's first self-made female millionaire. Not the first black female millionaire. The first female millionaire, period. She bought a mansion in upstate New York, right next to John D. Rockefeller's estate, just to prove that black excellence belonged everywhere white wealth did. But here's what they did to her legacy. For decades, white historians either erased her completely or credited her success to everyone except her. They said her white lawyer really ran the business. They claimed she just got lucky. Some textbooks mentioned her in a single sentence, if at all, because acknowledging that a black woman born into slavery had out-business, personed the captains of industry, would require admitting something they couldn't afford to admit. And it gets worse, because while Walker was becoming famous, there was another black woman who was even richer, and history buried her so deep that most people have never heard her name at all. Annie Malone was born in 1869 in Illinois, orphaned as a child, and built a hair care empire called Poro that made Madam C.J. Walker's company look small. At her peak, Malone was worth an estimated $14 million. She employed 75,000 people worldwide. She owned an entire city block in St. Louis that housed her factory, a school, a theater, and apartments for her workers. Walker actually got her start as one of Malone's sales agents before striking out on her own. Malone was the blueprint, but Malone made a critical mistake. She was too generous. She gave millions to orphanages, funded black schools and colleges, supported civil rights organizations, and became one of the first black female philanthropists in American history. And when she went through a bitter divorce in the 1920s, her white lawyers and a racist court system systematically drained her fortune through legal fees and judgments that would never have been applied to a white businesswoman. By the time she died in 1957, most of her wealth was gone, and history had erased her name so thoroughly that the innovations she pioneered were credited to others. Two of the richest self-made women in American history, both black and for over a century, America pretended they didn't exist. Now let's go back to that burning street in Tulsa. O.W. Gurley was born in 1868, just 3 years after the end of slavery. He moved to Oklahoma during the land rush and used his savings to buy 40 acres in a section of Tulsa that would become known as Greenwood. He had a vision. He wanted to create a place where black people could build wealth without depending on white businesses that discriminated against them. So he sold lots exclusively to black buyers and opened a rooming house and a grocery store. Other black entrepreneurs followed, and within 2 decades, Greenwood had transformed into the wealthiest black community in America. By 1921, this 35-block neighborhood had over 300 black-owned businesses. There were banks, hotels, movie theaters, law offices, doctor's offices, a hospital, a bus system, luxury cars on the streets, and multiple millionaires. Black Tulsans called it Little Africa. Everyone else called it Black Wall Street. A newspaper at the time described it as having more than a dozen churches, 5 hotels, 2 theaters, a library and a hospital, schools, law offices, a half-dozen grocery stores and as many restaurants, its own bus and taxi service, its own water system, and over 300 other commercial establishments. In the Jim Crow South, built by people whose parents had been enslaved. And then, on May 31st, 1921, it was all destroyed. A black teenager named Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a white elevator operator. He didn't do it, but that didn't matter. A white mob of thousands, many of them deputized by law enforcement, attacked Greenwood with guns, torches, and, according to eyewitness accounts, airplanes that dropped incendiary devices on buildings and fleeing families. Over 300 black people were murdered. 10,000 were left homeless. 35 blocks were burned to ash. O.W. Gurley's empire, along with every other black millionaire's holdings in Greenwood, was systematically destroyed. And here's the part that should make your blood boil. After the massacre, the city of Tulsa made it nearly impossible for black residents to rebuild by changing fire codes and zoning laws. Insurance companies refused to pay claims. And then, for 75 years, the Tulsa Race Massacre was completely removed from Oklahoma history textbooks. Removed. As if it never happened. The state literally erased one of the worst incidents of racial terrorism in American history, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that black wealth had existed and had been stolen. But Gurley wasn't the only one. In Memphis, Tennessee, a man named Robert Reed Church Sr. had already proven what was possible decades earlier. Church was born enslaved in 1839. During the Memphis Massacre of 1866, when white mobs attacked black neighborhoods, Church was shot in the head and left for dead. He survived. And then he made a decision that changed everything. He took $50, bought his first piece of real estate, and began building an empire. By 1912, Church was worth over $1 million, making him the first black millionaire in the South. He owned saloons, real estate throughout Memphis, and eventually opened Solvent Savings Bank, one of the first black-owned banks in America. But his greatest achievement was what he did when Memphis tried to segregate all public spaces and deny black citizens access to parks and gathering places. Church didn't protest. He didn't beg for inclusion. He spent $100,000 of his own money and built Church Park and Auditorium, a massive complex that became the cultural center of Black Memphis. Presidents spoke there. Booker T. Washington spoke there. Church's message was clear. If you exclude us from your world, we'll build a better one ourselves. His daughter, Mary Church Terrell, became one of the first black women to earn a college degree and a pioneering civil rights activist. But for decades, mainstream American history barely mentioned the Church family because their success undermined every narrative about black people needing white benevolence to succeed. They had done it themselves, with no help, in the face of violent opposition. Then there's the woman who might have been the richest of them all, and whose story is so deliberately obscured that historians are still piecing it together. Mary Ellen Pleasant was born around 1814, possibly into slavery, possibly free. What we know for certain is that by the 1850s, she was in San Francisco working as a cook and investor, and she was secretly one of the wealthiest financiers in the city. Some estimates put her fortune at $30 million in today's money. She used that money to do something extraordinary. She funded John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Yes, that John Brown, the abolitionist who tried to start a slave rebellion. Pleasant gave him $30,000, making her one of the largest financial backers of armed resistance to slavery. After the Civil War, Pleasant sued San Francisco streetcar companies for racial discrimination and won in 1866, 90 years before Rosa Parks. She fought for civil rights in court while building a business empire in real estate and boarding houses. But when she got into a legal battle with a white business partner who betrayed her, white newspapers launched a smear campaign calling her a voodoo queen and a witch. Racist courts sided against her repeatedly, and her fortune was systematically stolen through legal manipulation. By the time she died in 1904, history had forgotten her name almost entirely. The mother of civil rights in California, erased. In Birmingham, Alabama, a man named A.G. Gaston was born in a log cabin in 1892 to parents who had been enslaved. He started with nothing. He sold firewood and peanuts as a child, worked in the coal mines as a young man, and then began building what would become Birmingham's black business empire. Gaston founded an insurance company, a funeral home chain, a motel, a bank, and multiple other ventures. At his death in 1996 at age 103, he was worth $130 million. But Gaston's story isn't just about wealth, it's about resistance. During the height of the Civil Rights Movement in 1963, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Birmingham to lead protests, Gaston's motel became the headquarters for the entire campaign. Movement leaders stayed there. Strategy sessions happened there. And when white terrorists bombed the motel in an attempt to kill King and destroy the movement, Gaston rebuilt it. He understood that black wealth wasn't just about money. It was about having the resources to fight back, to provide safe spaces, and to fund the struggle for freedom. That's why they tried to erase these stories. Because black millionaires weren't just rich. They were dangerous to white supremacy. And finally, there's Biddy Mason, whose story might be the most incredible of all. Mason was born enslaved in Mississippi in 1818. In 1848, her master converted to Mormonism and decided to move to California. And he forced Mason to walk the entire 2,000 miles behind his wagon train, herding cattle while caring for her 3 daughters. When they arrived in California, a free state, Mason's master tried to move them all to Texas to keep them enslaved. But Mason had learned something on that long walk. She had learned her own worth. She sued for her freedom in 1856, and she won. With no education and no resources except her skills as a nurse and midwife, Mason began buying property in Los Angeles. Piece by piece, block by block. By the 1880s, she was one of the wealthiest black landowners in the city, worth over $300,000. And like so many of these millionaires, she used that wealth to uplift her community. She paid property taxes for families about to lose their homes. She funded schools and churches. She visited prisoners and provided for the poor. When she died in 1891, white Los Angeles tried to bury her in an unmarked grave in an attempt to erase her legacy. For 90 years, her story was forgotten until a historian digging through old property records discovered the truth. Biddy Mason had been one of the most important figures in early Los Angeles history, and the city had deliberately forgotten her. So here's what they don't want you to know. These 7 names represent just the beginning. Historians estimate that hundreds of black millionaires existed between 1865 and 1930, but their records were destroyed in courthouse fires, race massacres, and deliberate archival losses. The 1921 Tulsa massacre wasn't unique. Between 1898 and 1923, At least 26 black towns and business districts were destroyed by white mobs, often with government backing. Rosewood, Florida; Wilmington, North Carolina; Elaine, Arkansas. Each time, the pattern was the same: burn the buildings, murder the resistors, steal the land, and then erase it from history. The system didn't just steal their wealth, it stole their proof of existence. Because if future generations knew that black Americans had built millionaires and empires despite slavery, despite Jim Crow, despite terrorism, then every excuse for the racial wealth gap would fall apart. People couldn't say black people just need to work harder when the evidence shows they did work harder and their work was literally burned to the ground. They couldn't claim black people have no history of business success when the evidence shows they built thriving business districts that were systematically destroyed. The erasure wasn't an accident. It was the policy. So why does this matter now? Because every time someone suggests that black Americans are responsible for their own poverty, they're repeating a lie built on mass graves and erased history books. Black Americans did build wealth. They built it against impossible odds. And when they succeeded, the system destroyed it and then pretended it never existed. The racial wealth gap isn't the result of lack of effort or ability. It's the result of domestic terrorism, legal theft, and historical erasure. Madam C.J. Walker, O.W. Gurley, Robert Reed Church, Mary Ellen Pleasant, Annie Malone, A. G. Gaston, Biddy Mason. Say their names, share their stories, learn about the hundreds more who were erased. Because the greatest threat to oppression has always been remembering what they tried to make us forget. These 7 people proved that black excellence isn't new. It's been here all along. They just burned the receipts and hoped you'd never ask questions. But now you know, and knowing changes everything.